I have been a professional editor for about 15 years, and over my professional career, I have learned a lot of tricks to improve speed and quality and get the most out of Adobe Premiere, which is my primary editing tool. I want to give an intermediate to advanced look at editing to take what you're doing and improve it to help you edit faster. It is not dragging things onto the timeline and adding music. It goes a little bit deeper. I'm assuming that if you're here, you've already done the basics. You already have been editing for a while, but what I've found is a lot of people really find editing a drag, but I find some really cool stuff while I'm editing footage, and it can really be a fun process. So I'm going to talk about setting up. Being organized at the beginning is going to help you being organized in the middle and at the end. Let's get started. To be a fast and efficient editor, it's important to be organized. I'll show you here the file and folder structure that I use to keep everything in order. I found this structure to work best when you're using all new footage for every new project. This may not work well if you use the same footage over and over again on multiple projects. Here is a good folder structure. Let's go through each one of the folders one by one. On each one of the folders, I've started with 00 underscore, 01 underscore, etc. at the beginning of the folder names, so they'll always stay in the same order like I like them. Finals goes at the top. This folder stays empty until the very end. When I'm done with a project, I always export the final render and put it in this folder. So when I come back to a project later, I know right where my final export is. The project files folder should contain your actual Premiere project and all of the autosaves. If you have multiple versions of the project, they can also be saved in the same folder, but it should always be clear which one is the most recent. Footage. This tends to be the biggest folder of them all. Everything that has been shot or downloaded specifically for this project goes into this footage folder. This is especially helpful if anything becomes disconnected. Everything can be reconnected in this one folder. So, as a tip, if you download anything, take it out of your downloads folder immediately and put it into this footage folder. Stills. I use this folder to put screenshots of the video that may work for thumbnails for YouTube, blog images, or anything you may need it for. Graphics. If I have any titles, After Effects files, or featured images, I put them all in this graphics folder. The music folder. I think you know what this means. Any music that is featured in your project will go in here. Most of the time, I also put sound effects in here to keep it all in order. My last folder is additional files. The additional files folder could also be called random or extras, because every project is different that may use something that's out of the ordinary and you need somewhere else to organize it and put it. All these folders will be in a clearly labeled project folder on a hard drive or your local drive. And it will start pretty small, but as you get working, I'm sure it will grow with additional music, graphics, stills, and an ever-expanding project file. I used to use a very similar filing structure, but have modified this over the years to customize it for me. Adobe Premiere has gotten to a place that it can almost ingest everything and can export a whole bunch. I'm not going to go through every file type that Premiere can handle, but generally it can take anything you throw at it. I tend to use .mov files or .mp4 files with an H.264 codec, which is what is generally used online, so in my mind, there's less conversions needed between what I make and export and what someone sees online. Another codec I use is ProRes422 and ProRes4444. Remember, the resolution that is shot is the highest resolution your footage can ever be in at full quality. If you're using stills in your video, make sure they're big enough, but what is big enough? If your plan is to export an HD video, the pixel dimensions are 1920 by 1080. So if you show a full screen image, it needs to be those dimensions or more. If you're only taking up part of the screen with your image, it can be a lower resolution. And if you need the image with a clear background, that clear background is called an alpha channel. Alpha channels are often used in graphics. The file formats I tend to use for stills are JPEGs, or if I have an alpha channel, a PNG. The same goes for graphics. The graphics I tend to use need clear backgrounds, so I use PNGs for stills and .mov ProRes4444 for video. In the audio department, for sound effects and music, if you want very high quality audio, use a WAV file. WAV file sizes will be a little bit bigger, so I tend to use MP3s because I don't hear that big of a difference for the videos I'm making, and with a smaller file size, they load a lot quicker and are easier to store. But if audio quality is a big deal for you, you may want to use the full waves. Listen to the differences and see what you think. Because you've been editing for a while, I know that you've imported footage before, and I don't want to go over the basics again. But I do want to mention there are best ways in different scenarios. So let's import some footage. I have these two video files that I can drag over. I like drag and drop, that usually works best for me. But let's go over a few other ways. Sometimes I double click here, find what I'm looking for, and import this way. And on the rare occasion, I'll right click, hit import, and find the files like that. All these are pretty obvious, but why would you use one over the other? Normally I drag and drop, but sometimes I search footage this way, but that doesn't always work best. Sometimes I do a spotlight search right here, Command spacebar, and pull in this way. If you're very organized at a Finder level, it will definitely speed up the process here. When you import an entire project file, this menu comes up. Import entire project, import selected sequences, import as a shared project. I almost always do import entire project, like this. That works best for me. Here's why. When I click import selected sequences, I usually have to wait a long time for dynamic link to pull up all sequences, especially if it's a big project. This only imports the files you need, but it takes a lot longer. My workaround is to import the entire project, but create a folder for the imported items. I press OK, and everything goes right here into a folder. And now I can select what I need and delete the rest. Even though that's a few more clicks, I found it's even faster than waiting for the dynamic link to load the project. Here's an example of the wait time for something a little bit bigger. As you can see, I'm still waiting. Finally, it looks like it's pulled up everything, but it's still loading down here. I'm going to select this anyway, and now it's imported. Let's try importing the whole thing. Entire project, okay. Now everything is there, and I can find exactly what I need. Based on what you're doing, it may be a little different, but that's what I've found works for me. If most of your videos are very similar, create a template project with all of your graphics, your opener music, your intro graphics, so you don't have to find each element every time you start a new video. It may take a while to build your project, but it will save you tons of time in the long run. I have multiple types of projects I work on, but I have one master template project. I select the video type and delete the rest of the graphics. Save as something different, and start editing. Once you get going on your project, it's important to stay organized here to maximize efficiency. Here I'm editing an interview. I have video files, I have music, have some images, and so on. I don't like to lay down a law on organization inside Premiere if there are very few files. But the bigger the project is, the more important organization becomes. I like to think if I can see everything here, I don't need more than 1 or 2 folders. An important folder that I often keep is an old cut folder. If I get notes from a producer, I take the sequence, duplicate it, and call this version 1. Then I make a folder called old and put this in there. Hopefully, I'll never have to open old, but sometimes I want to go back to old cuts to see what changes were made. Other folders that might be good to have are images, music, footage, or even organizing your footage by different camera angles, scenes, or locations. On some projects, I've even organized footage by different camera operators, because I remember who got what footage. Try to find an organization that works for you, but I don't believe you have to overdo it. Always operate under the assumption that someone else will be coming in after you to pick up where you left off. That way, if you come back much later, you'll be able to easily find everything you did when you were in the zone. Keyboard shortcuts. A very useful feature in Premiere is how the keyboard shortcuts are displayed. If you click Premiere Pro and go to Keyboard Shortcuts, a layout of your keyboard will be shown with all the commands assigned to each key press. And if you press modifier keys like Command or Option, or multiple at a time, you can see clearly what everything does. To really increase your speed, you need to be well versed in the keyboard shortcuts you use the most. Watch yourself while you edit, and notice the processes that you're clicking through over and over again. If a process takes more than one click or a lot of mouse movement, there may be a better way to do it with a keyboard shortcut. I always keep one hand on the mouse and one hand on the keyboard. You're probably already using the keyboard to switch between the selection tool and the blade tool, probably copy and paste, probably undo, but there's so many buttons on the keyboard, there's so much that can be done. For example, I was noticing for myself, I would replace graphics a lot. I would have a new version and want to update it. So I would go to the timeline and right-click the old graphic, then scroll up to Replace, and then over to From Bin. That for me was too much movement. But when I looked over the default keyboard shortcuts, there was no shortcut assigned to this command. Command 1 was blank, so I created a custom keyboard shortcut for this process. Don't be afraid to add something that you use a lot, because in the end, if you don't use it, you can always delete it later. For me, it's often been hard to learn a lot of keyboard shortcuts at the same time. So I would often try to learn one a day or one a week, depending on how much I'd be editing. Find something new on your next project, use the keyboard shortcut over and over, and then it will be added to your repertoire. Another interesting thing about keyboard shortcuts is that I would often press the wrong key and add something I didn't mean to. So I've also learned about my accidental presses. For example, many times I've bumped an I or an O to mark an in or an out point on my timeline. And then later I want to get rid of those in and out points to have a cleaner looking timeline. So I looked in the keyboard shortcuts, and by holding Option and pressing X, you can clear the in and out. That was a resolution to my accidental button press. 1. Know the default keyboard shortcuts. 2. Know the keyboard shortcuts that are custom to you and your style of editing. 3. Don't be afraid to customize new commands. And 4. Know what to do when you have an accidental button press. There are so many buttons on a keyboard, and so many modifiers. Shift, Control, Option, Command, and combinations. So there's plenty of ways to use your opposite hand, decrease your mouse movement and clicks, and speed up your editing. When you first open Premiere, the first thing you see is the workspace. And just like you organize your files, it's nice to have a custom workspace that suits your needs to minimize clicking. This is the default editing workspace. It works, but it is not my favorite. Here's why. I think there's some wasted space, and clicking around to different tabs you use often is inefficient. For example, in the top left window, I have Source, Effect Controls, Audio Clip Mixer, and Metadata. Here, I hardly ever use metadata, and I hardly ever use the Audio Clip Mixer. So having them open is just giving room for lost time on a stray click. So I would close metadata, I would close Audio Clip Mixer, and leave Effect Controls and Source open. Down here in Project, we have Media Browser, Libraries, Info, Effects, Markers, History. All this is open. And if I need to get to Effects, I have to scroll over. And I use Effects a lot. Here, I see all my pointer tools. And by using keyboard shortcuts, I don't need to click any of these, so it's also wasted space for me. Here, the timeline is pretty small, and the audio meter at the bottom right, I only need when I'm concentrating on getting the audio levels perfect at the end of the piece. So this is the layout that I use. It works for me, but it might not work for you. I have my program monitor large and to the right, with no added buffer space on the left or right. And I have my source monitor a little bit smaller, since that's not what I need to be concentrating on. I have my effects controls always open for quick changes, and the effects themselves are right next to it for convenience. I don't need a wide project window, and my timeline is the maximum width. Watch yourself editing. Where do you click the most? What do you need to see details of? Where do you need to maximize space? This works well for me, but find the best workspace for you, and then go up to Window, Workspaces, and save that workspace. That workspace works most of the time, except when I'm concentrating on color. When I start going into color grading, I use Premiere's default color workspace. I have the scopes on the left and all the Lumetri color controls on the right, so I can go through shot by shot and adjust everything. Once I'm done, I go back to my favorite workspace. And by the way, this workspace has changed over time. Before, it looked a little different, but it has evolved after I've gotten more and more efficient with what I'm doing. And another one I created is vertical editing, for when I'm working with vertical video. You may want to start with the default editing workspace, make a few tweaks, and then save your workspace by clicking Save a New Workspace and naming it. Then if you make a lot of changes you don't like, you can always click here, reset to saved layout, and get back to what you saved. Every once in a while, I'll open my layout and none of the windows will be there. But when I click reset to saved layout, everything will be adjusted just like I had it saved. When you're done with a project, what are you going to deliver? You should know that at the very start of your project and make your sequence reflect it. Most of the time, you're probably going to deliver 1920 by 1080 HD video. That means 1920 pixels sideways, 1080 pixels up and down. If you're delivering something smaller, it's easy to output smaller, but if your sequence settings are something around 720p and you need to deliver 1080p, the video quality will not increase. It will be like you're stretching an image. Make sure your sequence settings are correct from the very beginning. This goes for frame rate as well. Your frame size, your sampling rate. I usually go 44:1 or 48. Choose a frame rate, that'll depend on your footage. A lot of times I have to deliver a square video for Facebook, so I swap the frame size here and can see exactly what I'm going to deliver. The quickest way to do this is to change the 1920 to 1080 and make a square frame like that. Acknowledge that you're doing it, and then you'll have a square video. If you're editing 4K footage but you're going to output at 1080p, use a 1080p sequence. It'll edit a little bit faster, and that's all you'll need if you're only going to use 1080p exports. You'll be able to easily zoom in on the 4K footage and make smaller sized graphics. If you have a piece of footage and you want to make a sequence exactly with those same settings, drag it onto the new sequence button and start from there. Again, taking these few extra seconds at the beginning to set up right will help you edit faster. When you're done with a project, what are you going to deliver? You should know that at the very start of your project and make your sequence reflect it. Most of the time, you're probably going to deliver 1920 by 1080 HD video. That means 1920 pixels sideways, 1080 pixels up and down. If you're delivering something smaller, it's easy to output smaller, but if your sequence settings are something around 720p and you need to deliver 1080p, the video quality will not increase. It will be like you're stretching an image. Make sure your sequence settings are correct from the very beginning. This goes for frame rate as well. Your frame size, your sampling rate. I usually go 44:1 or 48. Choose a frame rate, that'll depend on your footage. A lot of times I have to deliver a square video for Facebook, so I swap the frame size here and can see exactly what I'm going to deliver. The quickest way to do this is to change the 1920 to 1080 and make a square frame like that. Acknowledge that you're doing it, and then you'll have a square video. If you're editing 4K footage but you're going to output at 1080p, use a 1080p sequence. It'll edit a little bit faster, and that's all you'll need if you're only going to use 1080p exports. You'll be able to easily zoom in on the 4K footage and make smaller sized graphics. If you have a piece of footage and you want to make a sequence exactly with those same settings, drag it onto the new sequence button and start from there. Again, taking these few extra seconds at the beginning to set up right will help you edit faster. When I collaborate with someone and someone sends me their footage and project on a hard drive, I almost always get this error. Missing media for these clips. It's usually that someone's left something in a downloads folder on their desktop. Here's a way to avoid this problem. When you're ready to send out a project, go to File, Project Manager. Here you select the sequence that you want, in this case F interview, And right below it, collect files and copy to new location. You can set the destination to an external hard drive, and it will copy all the files onto that hard drive, including anything that you still have on your desktop or in some other folder. It may take a while, but you'll be sure to hand off everything that you need. Sometimes this helps if you have hundreds of gigs worth of footage, but you're only using one small part. Here, if I sent this sample project out, it calculates the approximate file size of everything that you'll be sending out. Press OK and wait a while. It's nice when other people do this for you to set you up well. So when you send out things, be courteous, do the same thing. And just like it says in the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself, you want to set other people up for success so they will set you up for success.